They say the most dangerous man in the city, never once raised his voice, never flinched at a loaded gun pressed to his temple, never blinked while a rival bled out across his marble floors. And yet the thing that finally brought Matteo Salveri to his knees was a soft-spoken plus-size maid with cinnamon under her fingernails and $41,000 of debt hanging around her neck like a stone. Nobody in that cold fortress on the North Shore saw her coming. They never do. The ones the world overlooks are always the ones who change everything, and Cora Bell was about to change a house that everyone else had already given up as dead. The Salveri estate sat above Lake Michigan, like a tomb dressed in money, 12,000 square feet of imported stone and silence, and inside it, a child had been screaming for the better part of a year. Leo Salveri was 2 years old, and he had buried his mother before he could say the word, and the only language he had left for his grief was rage. He shrieked until his small face went purple. He threw whatever he could lift. He bit the hands that tried to soothe him and arched his back away from every embrace, and one by one the nannies came up the long gravel drive in their pressed uniforms with their glowing references, and one by one they left within the week, some of them crying, one of them with a fresh red welt across her wrist, all of them murmuring the same useless thing on their way out the door, that there was something wrong with that child, that no one could reach him, that the boy was simply broken. Matteo heard them and said nothing. He stood at the window of his study with a glass of Barolo he never drank and watched the taillights disappear down toward the city, and the muscle in his jaw moved, and nothing else did. He was a man carved from violence, the architect they called him, because he built empires the way other men built model ships, patiently, ruthlessly, never leaving a seam exposed, and he had ordered the deaths of men who deserved far worse, and he could not for the life of him reach his own son. The boy looked at him with eyes that were too much like hers, and Matteo, who noticed everything, who could read a man's intentions from the angle of his shoulders across a crowded room, could not read his own child, and that helplessness was the one wound he never showed anyone. So the house grew colder. The staff learned to move through it like ghosts, eyes down, voices low, and the screaming became the only honest sound in all that beautiful frozen space. Across the city, in a one-room walk-up above a laundromat where the radiators clanked all night and the windows leaked February straight through the glass, Cora Bell was counting out crumpled bills onto a kitchen counter she shared with no one, and the number she kept arriving at was never enough. She was 28 years old, and she had spent the last 3 of those years watching her mother die slowly in a hospital bed. And the cancer had been thorough about 2 things, taking her mother and taking everything else. And when the funeral was over, what remained was the medical debt, a figure so large it had stopped feeling like money and started feeling like a sentence. She cleaned offices at night and houses by day, and she was good at it, quietly, invisibly good, the kind of good no one ever thanked her for, and still the interest grew faster than she could shovel against it. The worst of the debt was not even the hospitals. The worst of it belonged to a man named Vince Marlowe, who lent money to desperate people out of the back of a car dealership on the South Side, and who had given her cash when no bank would, so she could keep the lights on during the last terrible month of her mother's life. And Vince Marlowe did not forget, and Vince Marlowe did not forgive. And Cora had learned to flinch when her phone buzzed, because half the time it was him reminding her, in that wet, smiling voice, exactly what she owed, and exactly what kinds of payment he might be willing to accept instead. She had learned, too, to make herself small in rooms, to apologize for the space she took up, to read every glance at her body as confirmation of the thing she already believed, that she was too much and not enough at the same time, too wide for the world and too quiet to matter. She had stopped looking in mirrors. So when the agency called about a live-in position at a private estate, room and board included, a salary so high she made the woman repeat it twice, she did not ask the obvious questions. She did not ask why a job that paid that much had gone unfilled for so long. She only heard the part where she might, if she lasted, finally get out from under Vince Marlowe's thumb, and she said yes before her fear could talk her out of it. The car they sent for her was black and silent and smelled of leather and money, and the man who drove it did not speak. And Cora sat in the back with her single suitcase on her lap and watched the city give way to bare trees and tall gates until they turned up a drive that seemed to go on for a mile. The house, when it finally appeared, did not look like a home. It looked like a place where homes went to be embalmed. A stone-faced housekeeper named Mrs. Atchison met her at the door and looked her up and down the way people always did, the quick assessing sweep that took in her size and filed her away, and the corner of the woman's mouth tightened just enough to say everything. "They've sent us another one," the look said, "and this one won't even be able to keep up with the stairs." A tall, terrifyingly still man stood at the foot of the grand staircase with his hands folded in front of him, and he introduced himself as Enzo, and he said he handled the household's particular needs, and the way he said particular made the back of Cora's neck go cold. From somewhere above them, muffled by all that stone, came the sound of a child screaming as though the world were ending, and Mrs. Atchison sighed the sigh of a woman who had stopped hearing it months ago, and Enzo's flat dark eyes moved toward the stairs and then back to Cora, and he said simply that she should understand the position was not truly about cleaning. The cleaning was the cover. The position was the boy. 3 nannies in the last 2 months alone, he told her. The best in the city, and not one of them had managed a full week. She would be expected to keep the rooms, yes, but what the household needed, what Mr. Salveri needed, was someone the child did not destroy. He said all of this without inflection, and then he led her up the stairs toward the screaming, and Cora, who had spent her whole life being underestimated, felt for the first time in a long time something other than fear. She felt the small, hard certainty of a person walking toward the one thing she might actually be able to do. The nursery was a battlefield dressed as a magazine spread. There were $10,000 of imported toys scattered and overturned, a designer crib pushed against the wall, and in the center of it, a small boy with dark curls and a tear-streaked face was hurling a wooden block at a young woman in a uniform who was retreating toward the door with her hands up. The latest Nanny. She fled past Cora without a word, and then it was just Cora and Enzo and Mrs. Atchison in the doorway, and the boy, Leo, who took one look at the new adult and wound up to scream again with everything his small lungs could give, and Cora did the thing that none of the experts had done. She did not rush him. She did not crouch with her arms out and her face arranged into the bright, desperate cheer that children can smell from across a room. She did not try to fix him. She simply walked slowly to the far corner of the nursery, lowered herself down onto the rug with a soft grunt because her knees were not built for grand entrances, and she began, very quietly, to stack the fallen blocks into a small, crooked tower, humming under her breath the same low, tuneless lullaby her own mother had hummed over a kitchen sink 100 years ago. She did not look at the boy at all. She paid him no attention whatsoever. She built her little tower and hummed her little song and let the silence in the room belong to him for once, instead of demanding it for the adults. And the screaming faltered. It hitched and dropped, and the boy stood there in the wreckage of his rage, breathing hard and staring at this large, soft stranger who wanted nothing from him. And curiosity, which is stronger than grief because it belongs to the living, pulled him one unsteady step closer. Then another. Mrs. Atchison opened her mouth to warn her, and Enzo lifted one finger and stopped her. Leo crossed the whole ruined room and stood at Cora's elbow, and he reached out one fat small hand and put a block on top of her tower. And Cora, still not looking at him, said in the gentlest voice in the world, "Good. That's a good one." And the boy made a sound that no one in that house had heard in a year. He laughed. And then he climbed into the warm, wide lap of a woman he had met 4 minutes ago, and he put his thumb in his mouth and his cheek against her chest, and he went silent. Completely, impossibly silent. the kind of silence that follows an exhausted child into sleep. Mrs. Atchison's hand had risen to her own throat. Enzo had gone very still, and a man like Enzo going still meant something. And neither of them noticed that down the hall, drawn by the unfamiliar quiet, the way other men are drawn by alarms, Matteo Salveri had appeared in the doorway and was watching the impossible thing happening on the floor of his son's room with an expression that, for the first time in a very long time, no one could read because even he did not know its name. He did not speak that night. He stood in the doorway until the boy was fully asleep, and then he turned and walked away. And Cora carried the warm weight of the child to his crib and laid him down and stood over him a moment, her heart aching in a way she had not let it ache since the funeral. And then she went to the small staff room they had given her, and she lay awake half the night wondering what she had stepped into. But the next morning, when the boy woke screaming as he always did, the household held its breath, and Cora went to him, and within minutes the screaming stopped, and within an hour the boy was trailing her around the kitchen on unsteady legs, while she rolled out dough, demanding in his handful of words to help. And so it began, slowly, the thawing of a frozen house. Cora did not set out to change anything but the child. She baked because baking was what she knew, because her mother had taught her that you could not fix grief, but you could fill a kitchen with the smell of vanilla and cinnamon and butter, and a house that smells of those things is harder to despair in. She baked bread, and she baked the little almond cookies her mother had made, and the smell crept out of the kitchen and along the cold hallways and into rooms that had not smelled of anything but money for years, and the staff began, almost against their will, to linger near the warm part of the house. Mrs. Atchison, who had filed Cora away on the first day, found herself bringing her cups of tea and then, eventually, sitting down to drink one beside her, and the boy bloomed. He slept through entire nights now without waking. He ate everything she set before him with a healthy boy's hunger. He said new words every day, and one of those words, to the astonishment of everyone, was Cora, said as a small triumphant shout whenever she entered a room. And the first time Matteo heard his son say a name with joy in it, the architect, the most dangerous man in the city, had to leave the room and stand alone in his study for a long time. He started coming home earlier. He told himself it was about the boy, and it was, at first. He would arrive in the evening and find the two of them in the kitchen, his son on a stool with flour on his nose, and this woman beside him, with her sleeves pushed up and her dark hair coming loose. And the warmth of the room would hit him like a wall after the cold of the world he moved through all day, and he would stand in the doorway, the way he had that first night, watching, and he began to notice things about her, the way he noticed everything, except that these were not the kinds of things he usually catalogued. He noticed the way she hummed without knowing she was doing it. He noticed that she touched his son with a gentleness that did not seem to cost her anything, that came out of her endlessly, like water. He noticed that she made herself smaller when he entered, folded her shoulders in, tugged her cardigan closed over her body, as though she expected him to look at her the way the world had taught her to expect, with judgment, with dismissal, and it angered him. This flinch, though it took him a while to understand why. He noticed the scent of vanilla that lived on her skin, warm and clean, and he found, to his deep private irritation, that he could pick it out of the air the moment he walked into the house, that he had begun, without deciding to come home looking for it. One evening, he found her on her knees scrubbing a wine stain out of a rug, apologizing before he had said a word, explaining that Leo had knocked the glass and she would have it out in a moment. Please, she was so sorry. And Matteo looked down at this woman apologizing for a child's accident in a house where men had bled out without anyone apologizing for the carpet, and he said quietly, "Stop." She froze. He said, "You do not have to apologize for taking up space in this house." And then, because he was a man who chose his words the way other men chose bullets, he said the thing that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "You do not take up too much space," he told her. "For the first time in years, because of you. This house finally feels full. She did not have an answer for that. She had spent 28 years being told she was too much, and here was the most feared man in the city, telling her there had not, until now, been nearly enough of her. And something in her chest that had been clenched tight for a very long time came loose, and she had to look away so he would not see her eyes fill. The thaw became a slow burn. Matteo did not court her the way ordinary men court women, with flowers and clumsy speeches, because he was not an ordinary man, and because he was, beneath the ice, terrified of frightening her away. He courted her in the language he knew, which was the language of providing, of protecting, of noticing. New clothes appeared in her room, not a uniform, but soft, beautiful things in her exact size. Things cut to flatter a body she had been taught to hide, and a note in his slanting hand that said only, "You should be dressed the way you deserve." He learned how she took her coffee and made sure it was waiting. He sat with her and the boy in the evenings now, this lethal man perched too large on a kitchen stool, and he watched his son press a cookie into Cora's hand, and he watched Cora laugh, the full, unguarded laugh that shook her whole frame. And he caught himself wanting nothing in the world so much as to be the cause of it. One night, after the boy was asleep, they stood together at the tall windows looking down at the lake, and the moon laid a road of silver across the black water, and Matteo turned to her and lifted one hand, slowly, the way a man approaches a deer in a clearing, and he tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and his fingers grazed the warm curve of her cheek, and he said, in a voice she had never heard him use with anyone, that she was the most beautiful thing that had ever walked into his life, that her softness was not a flaw to be apologized for, but the only warmth in a cold world, that he wanted her, mia cara, all of her, exactly as she was. And Cora, who had stopped looking in mirrors years ago, looked instead into the eyes of a man who saw her clearly and wanted her anyway. And for the first time she believed it might be true. He kissed her then, slow and deep and certain, and the cold house held its breath around them, and a thing that had been impossible became, in that moment, the realest thing in the world. But the past does not stay buried, because we have found happiness. It waits, and it watches, and it follows the smell of money like a dog. Vince Marlowe had not forgotten Cora Bell, and when his collectors reported that the fat girl who owed him 40 grand had vanished from her walk-up and turned up living large at some estate on the North Shore, his wet smile spread across his face, and he saw an opportunity far better than mere repayment. He drove out himself one gray afternoon, when he knew the boss was away in the city, and he got past the gate by claiming to be from a catering company, and he found Cora in the garden, walking the boy along the hedges, and the sight of him stopped the blood in her veins. He told her, in that voice that crawled, exactly how things were going to be now. He knew who owned this house. He knew what kind of man Matteo Salveri was, and he knew what kind of man Matteo Salveri would not want his business associates knowing about, that the new woman in his bed was a debtor on the run, and Vince could make that very awkward, very public, very dangerous, unless Cora was reasonable. The debt could grow, he said, or the debt could disappear, and which one depended entirely on how grateful she was prepared to be. And he reached out and gripped her arm hard enough to bruise, hard enough to leave the marks of 4 fingers in a ring around her soft flesh, and he leaned in close and called her a fat cow, who should be grateful any man wanted to touch her at all, and he told her he would be back, and he would expect his answer and his hands. He let her go, and he walked back down the drive whistling, and Cora stood among the hedges shaking, the boy tugging at her skirt, asking why she was sad. And she pulled herself together for the child's sake, because that was the kind of strength she had always had, the quiet kind, and she said it was nothing, sweetheart, nothing at all. And she pulled her sleeve down over the marks, and she did not say a word. She thought she could hide it. She did not understand yet who she was living with. Matteo Salveri had built an empire on the principle that nothing happened in his world that he did not see. and he had been watching this woman with the focused attention of a man in love for weeks, and so he saw it the moment he came home that evening, before she had said anything, before she had even fully turned toward him. He saw the way she held her arm. He saw the new careful flatness she had put over her face like a mask, the same flatness he wore himself, and he knew it for what it was, because he was the one she had learned it from. He crossed the room to her, and he took her hand, gently, so gently, and he pushed back her sleeve, and there in the lamplight were the 4 dark fingerprints pressed into her skin, and Cora watched the temperature of the room drop. She watched something happen to the man she loved that she had heard about but never seen. He did not shout. The architect never shouted. He went instead, terrifyingly calm, the calm of deep water, the calm that men in his world had learned to fear far more than any rage. And he asked her one question in a voice as quiet and level as a blade laid flat. Who did it? She tried to tell him it was nothing, that it was her own problem, her own debt, her own shame. And he listened to all of it without moving, and when she had finished, he cupped her face in both his hands with infinite tenderness, and he kissed her forehead, and he said, "You misunderstand me, Mia Regina. There is no your problem anymore. There is only ours." And then, softer still, the words that would echo in that house forever after. The words that were the true heart of the man beneath the ice. Nobody threatens my family. Nobody. He had her tell him everything then. The debt, the mother, the long, hard years, and the name, Vince Marlowe. And as she spoke, Matteo simply held her. And over her shoulder, his eyes found Enzo standing in the doorway. And the 2 men looked at each other, and nothing else needed to be said. What happened to Vince Marlowe happened quietly, the way the most permanent things always do. He did not see it coming, because men like Vince Marlowe never believe the world will hold them accountable. They believe their cruelty is cleverness, and their predation is strength, right up until the moment something larger and colder than themselves removes them from the board. He came back to the estate 3 days later, as he had promised, expecting a frightened woman and an easy payday. And he was met at the gate instead by Enzo and 2 other men who were unfailingly polite as they invited him to a meeting with Mr. Salveri to discuss his account. They drove him to a warehouse on the river. Matteo was waiting, seated in a single chair in the center of all that empty space, dressed as immaculately as ever, his hands folded, and he did not stand when Vince was brought in, and he did not raise his voice once during the entire conversation. He simply explained, in patient and exact terms, the nature of the error Vince had made. He explained that the woman Vince had put his hands on, the woman he had marked and frightened and called a name in a garden, was under Matteo Salveri's protection, was, in fact, the most cherished thing in his world, and that there was no debt large enough to purchase the right to touch her, and that the $41,000 Vince believed he was owed had just become the least of his concerns. He let the silence stretch. He let Vince Marlowe understand, slowly, all at once, exactly how badly he had miscalculated, watched the bluster drain out of the man and the sweat bead on his forehead, and then Matteo stood and buttoned his jacket, and on his way out, he paused beside the suddenly very quiet loan shark and said one last thing, almost gently, that the debt was forgiven, every cent, and that Vince Marlowe would never again be in a position to lend money to a desperate woman, and would never again be in a position to do much of anything at all. Then he walked out into the gray afternoon and got into his car, and he did not look back, and the river kept its secrets the way rivers do. The architect had built many things in his life. The thing he built that day was a guarantee, written in a language only his world could read, that the woman he loved would never again live in fear. He came home to her clean, unhurried, and he found her in the kitchen waiting up, the boy long asleep, and she searched his face and saw what she needed to see and asked no questions she did not want answered. He crossed the room and he took her in his arms and he held her for a long time without speaking. And then he tipped her chin up and he told her it was finished, that the debt was gone, that Vince Marlowe was gone, that there was nothing left in the whole world for her to be afraid of. And Cora began to cry. Not the small, careful tears she had allowed herself before, but great heaving sobs of relief. 3 years of fear and grief and shame pouring out of her at last, and Matteo held her through all of it, murmuring into her hair in his mother's language, calling her his queen, his heart, telling her she was safe, she was home, she belonged here, with him, with the boy, forever. And when the storm had passed, she stood in the circle of his arms in the warm, bright kitchen of a house that had once been a tomb and was now, unmistakably, a home. And she felt the last of the old belief that she was too much and not enough dissolve and wash away. She let him lead her to the tall windows where the moon lay its silver road across the lake. And there, in that house she had brought back to life, the most dangerous man in the city went down on one knee before the plus-size maid the whole world had overlooked, and he asked her to be his wife, to be a mother to his son who already loved her more than air, to be the queen of everything he had built. And Cora Bell, who had walked up that gravel drive with one suitcase and $41,000 of fear, looked down at the man kneeling before her like an answered prayer and said yes. He rose and he kissed her, deep and slow and absolutely certain. And somewhere upstairs, the little boy who had hated every nanny in the city slept soundly because the one person who had ever truly seen him was finally never going to leave. The cold house was warm now, top to bottom, full of the smell of vanilla and the sound of a child's laughter and the impossible, ordinary miracle of a family that had found one another in the dark. And isn't that the most beautiful thing? That the woman everyone wrote off, the one they called too much and not enough, turned out to be the queen the whole underworld never saw coming. The one soft thing strong enough to thaw a heart of ice and tame a child of fire all at once. If this story warmed you the way it warmed that frozen house, if you cheered when she stacked those blocks and held your breath when those fingerprints showed in the lamplight and felt that fierce satisfaction when the architect set everything right, then do me a favor and let me know, because stories like this one only keep coming when people like you show up for them. So go ahead and smash that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the people the world overlooks are often the strongest of all. And subscribe to the channel and tap that notification bell so you never miss the next one. Because I promise you, the next story is even bigger. And tell me down in the comments, when Vince put his hands on Cora in that garden, did you already know Matteo would burn the whole world down for her? Or did you gasp right along with the rest of us when he went so terrifyingly quiet and asked who did it? Drop your answer below. Tell me your favorite moment, and I will see you in the next one.